Welcome to Sanity, a podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week, along with my co-host Rebecca Sugar, we'll make sense out of the nonsense and deliver a little bit of sanity to your week.
We like to start every show with a quote about sanity. This one's by Dave Barry, American author and columnist, who said, "Granted, the system is insane, but we must not let sanity stand in the way of airport security." Those of you who saw the video earlier this week of the naked woman running through Dallas-Fort Worth Airport will know why I chose that one. And I think we've all felt like that at an airport at some point. May not have done it, but we've definitely gotten ourselves to that point. So we're the Sanity podcast. I felt like I should start with something that was a little bit insane.
I like that. I mean, talk about zones of insanity. Airports, I think, would be
Top
the
of the
place
list.
for that. Yeah. Okay, so our top story this week is Signalgate, the story in the Atlantic from a Sun alum, Jeff Goldberg, that has set off 1,000 memes and 1 million conversations about state secrets. Our Make It Make Sense segment this week is following up on Columbia and asking really hard questions about execution and what's actually happening on campuses and to some students as well. Our tipping point is going to look at the upcoming Wisconsin Supreme Court race. It's a race that's attracted the attention of Elon Musk and about 20 million of his dollars. And as a way of looking at the what story is being told by some of these under the radar races that could herald some really important changes in the future. And we'll end with our usual sunburn and maybe suntan from me today. Okay. So Rebecca, what do you make of Signalgate?
Well, look, I think to begin with, whenever these stories come out in the news, it always feels the same. It feels like, depending on your partisan interest, you sort of latch on to the critique of the other side, and there's plenty to go around. So I would say that the hypocrisy of those on the right who are treating this as a nothing burger when they screamed about Hillary Clinton's server in the basement should be noted, as should the Democrats' hysteria over this. Maybe classified information being used on a non-secure channel, maybe not. We still don't quite know. We think we know. And their silence when Hillary was sort of bleaching and pounding at that same server. So I think the American public sort of understands the politics of this. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's the least interesting part of the conversation and the story. And I think anybody who actually is worried about our sensitive information being used on non-secure platforms can rest assured that after this, they won't be doing it again. Mm-hmm. So we can at least feel safe that Signal will no longer be the method by which this cast of administration characters will be talking about strikes on the Houthis or anybody else. I think the really interesting things came up in the actual text of the conversations that we saw. One of them was about, well, just a small thing, but maybe not so small, was that Mike Waltz pointed out in one of his texts that the reason that the Americans would have to go in and do this is because the Europeans do not have the capability to strike back at the Houthis and defeat their ballistic systems, and they don't have the navies to do this. And I thought that was really interesting. What's happening with the European Navy and why can't they do this without us? And that leads us, of course, to J.D. Vance's sort of complaint about the Europeans and how we're always bailing them out, as he said. And clearly his posture towards the Europeans, we saw that in Munich and we see it now, is that we're constantly bailing them out, as he said, and we're helping them in ways that they should be helping themselves more. I think that's an important MAGA point and one that resonates with a lot of people. And also importantly, I think it was also Vice President Vance who talked about how the Americans, if we do this, should be thinking about what we're going to get in return financially, actually. And that's another major MAGA point that often gets missed in these geopolitical conversations, that when we invest our resources and our time and our military and our treasure in other areas of the world, because it's in America's interest and it should redound to America's interest. That's a conversation that doesn't happen often enough, I think, in the sort of foreign policy sector. And then just lastly, Matt Rice had a piece in The Sun this morning, sort of pointing to this MAGA Republican divide, and how for a lot of MAGA observers of these, or readers of these texts, this highlighted a concern that they have that Mike Waltz is a more traditional, maybe neoconservative, conservative type who favors the old ways of bombing everything and everyone out there. And they lean in to a more J.D. Vance, isolationist, restrictionist kind of position. And this highlighted that division in the Trump world.
Yeah, I think that was a really substantive way to read these texts, and I think that I agree with you that that's part of the fascination, is getting a glimpse into the digital room where it happens, and what these conversations look like. I think one thing to say is I agree with you about hypocrisy. It's glaring. If I were the administration, I would have sort of just say, hey, listen, we really screwed up. It won't happen again. I think the defiance is sort of the modus operandi of Trump world, and it has been for a long time. In another administration, you could see firings. That's just not how Trump works, and so we'll see if it blows over, and we'll see whether that was politically.
Well, can I just ask you,
effective.
have we seen firings in other administrations on things like? I mean, we haven't, as far as I can tell, which is, I think, part of the problem. Which is not to excuse the lack of accountability here, but it's to say it has been the pattern, and I think this sort of pearl clutching about it reads as insincere.
Well, certainly in the first Trump term, there were firings right and left. I guess, I mean, it seems that Trump has sort of learned from his earlier experience as an administrator, and seems less willing to engage in that kind of rotation of personnel, let's say, and maybe that means he's more comfortable with the people he has and wants to give them more of a runway. Second, it's an astounding story. I mean, talk about there was a quote from Graydon Carter was celebrating his book launch last night, the longtime Vanity Fair editor, and he said, fuck, what an easy scoop. I mean, talk about something just falling into your lap.
Jeff Goldberg's lucky day.
Jeff Goldberg, as if Jeff Goldberg needs another laurel on his cap, but sometimes this stuff just does fall into your lap, and we had to take you a little bit behind the scenes at the Sun, sort of a really I think interesting sort of conversation about, well, what would you have done, if you were that journalist, and how long would you have stayed in the chat, and would you have signaled, I'm here? Would you have raised a hand or not?
Did anybody say that they would have? I think any journalist would have done exactly what Jeff Goldberg did.
I think that's right. But he did leave at some point. And so there's an interesting debate there, I think, about kind of how you would have behaved. And but to go to the substance, I totally agree. I think the headline substantive point here is the ideological factions within this high council of state. And I think there's no question that J.D. Vance sees the world differently than a lot of these other folks. I think one reason for that is purely structural. I mean, remember, the vice president does not really report to the president in the same way that the other cabinet members do. He's independently elected, even though he's on the presidential ticket. So that's just one kind of constitutional point. And I'm not saying that in every moment J.D. Vance is thinking about that sort of technical difference. But I do think generally vice presidents have a sort of different role, than people who are, really directly reporting to the president in a way.
Can I just interrupt? Sorry to say, I think a lot of people are reading that as a rift between these different factions. And I did not read that in the text. I read what Republicans are trying to use as a way to smooth this over. But I really do think that it's true that this was a healthy conversation about differing perspectives on what should be done. Vance didn't say, he wasn't screaming hair on fire. He said, I think we should wait. I don't necessarily want to do this. Hegseth and others said we should do it. And then he said, I defer to the group. And I think that that's a good sign. I don't think that's an excuse for what happened, but I think it's a good sign and not a sign of something terrible going on in the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, to close read the text, by all accounts, this group has good interactions and relationships. I mean, I think it's clear that there's a fair amount of mutual respect there, and the tone, as you said, was polite and sort of encouraging and mutually encouraging. But I think, we are piecing together from the Munich speech, I'd even argue from the Zelensky meeting, to this chat, Vance does think about Europe differently. And that it's becoming clear that it's not just a posture, that it is a deep sort of disagreement with Europe's way of being, I think, and the role they're playing in international affairs. We'll see what happens in Greenland, but there is a sort of Vance doctrine, I think, that is emerging.
Would you separate that between Western Europe and Eastern Europe?
I'm not sure. I mean, we have the Ukraine case. Now, maybe you can say that's a little bit different. But I think as a whole, there's just a lot of skepticism to the continent. I'm not sure, how you'd break it down by individual country. But I see it differently. I see an attack on the Houthis not really as – I do see in America's interest. I think America's interest in shipping – has been longstanding, going back to the beginning of the Republic, and just generally, we talked with Mike Duran last week about the interest in countering Iran and the threat that the Houthis play. So this to me is, and I actually applaud the administration for taking the action they did. So
right, Hegseth's point about the shipping, even though only 2% of it directly affects U.S. ships, the broader story is that it all affects U.S. markets. And Hegseth also pointed out the deterrence, point of this, and that's a really important one. We've sort of lost deterrence in that region. He feels, and this administration feels, and reestablishing it matters.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. We'll also see what happens going forward. I mean, it's going to take more than one strike or even several strikes to kind of dislodge the Houthis. Another thing Mike Duran told us is that they're a force to be reckoned with.
Absolutely.
And we'll see how these different strands of argument sort of play out. Now that we've seen a little bit behind the scenes, we'll now see, in front of the curtain, and how that unfolds going forward.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to Make It Make Sense.
Great.
Shall we? Make It Make Sense this week, as you said, is about Columbia University. This is your favorite topic.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to, do you want to jump
right in? They should
in?
Almost give me an honorary degree.
Yes. Right. Do you want one? That's the question.
No, I have enough.
Okay, so we know that the Trump administration has been pushing back against Columbia University because of its lack of control over these protests and mobs and harassment and other sort of actions of sometimes violence against Jewish students. And they've revoked $400 million so far of federal funding. They're threatening to do more. And they had a list of things that they wanted the school to comply with. And the problem that came up this week is that the school, while it said that it was complying, doesn't seem to be complying with some or all of them. And we should talk about all of them sort of as individual items, because I don't know that we necessarily agree that all of them were healthy requirements in the first place. But one of them, of course, was masks, that they should ban masks. The university have said that they have banned it. And of course, we've seen all week, protests at Columbia with people in masks. Including faculty. Yeah. So the interim president, Katrina Armstrong, sort of made public statements and then private statements about some of her positions. The one about, hiring 36 new security officers, people on the ground that I know at Columbia haven't seen any evidence of that, but it's hard to tell, officially if they've hired those people. And then there was this issue of putting the Middle East Studies Department into receivership, which the school then negotiated with the administration that they would just hire some interim department, a provost to supervise and oversee its activities. It's sort of a notorious department, to be fair, and it's not been a beacon of unbiased, great education at the university. And so doing something about it would seem to make sense if you want to secure the rights of Jewish students, but maybe even more broadly, just the position of Columbia University as an elite institution that's actually teaching real things. However, the idea of putting a department, the federal government, demanding that a school put one of its departments into receivership worries me on the free speech front and on the encroachment of the federal government in education. It's not a simple issue. It's complex, and there are arguments, I think, to be made on both sides. But I would very much worry that people who see this as a win for their Jewish students on that campus might find themselves on the other side of this in a future scenario where a different kind of federal government might say that the Jewish Studies Department at school X is promoting hatred through teaching Zionism and would call for a receivership of that department. So I think we want to be careful in dealing with really real problems on Columbia's campus, terrible problems in some cases for the students who are there, but dealing with them in a way that makes sense and that protects everyone's rights.
Right. No, I think that's well said, Rebecca. I do think that the supervision of a department of syllabi of curriculum is a sort of does cross a kind of Rubicon around academic freedom. I have no problem with the mask issue. I mean, as someone who was an undergrad, a graduate student, a dean of students at Harvard, a resident tutor, there are a million rules at these schools. When you can drink, when you can't drink, where you can walk at certain. I'm just
Yes.
The idea that a school can't make rules is just wild. And in my time at Harvard, the idea that you would be able to wear a mask when there's such an obsession about safety and identity. I mean, one of the worst things you could do at the, we call them houses, at the dorm where I was a tutor, was to let someone else in on your ID or to not have your ID.
Right.
And the idea was, well, we don't know who's entering. We don't know who's on campus. And so to see this situation where there are people who might not even be students, there are people, I mean, it's just, so I have very few qualms about issues around security.
To that point, I just want to say I was astounded several years ago. I just took a class that a friend of mine was teaching at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. I just wanted to listen in. It was a really interesting course. And I walked straight into that building, straight through the turnstiles and right into the elevator and up to his class without having to show not just a Columbia ID card, which I did not have, but any form of ID. So my sense is that these campuses are wide open in ways that most people would be shocked to find out about.
Yeah. And, and I have no problem also with putting pressure on these organizations like Student for Justice in Palestine that as a bombshell lawsuit this week seemed to have known about October 7th before it happened. I mean, so by all means, use the law to kind of go after those. The situation has gotten so bad in so many different vectors that there's a lot of work to do. But I take your point about, and I will say, I think the intellectual culture on these campuses, including faculty, is part of the problem. So I'm not sort of ignorant or sort of ignoring the idea that probably to really fix these campuses, you probably do have to address the ideology. The question is this kind of intrusion sort of the way to do it? And I would say on the issue of compliance, that's one of the dangers of these kind of deals that Trump is cutting with, whether it be colleges or law firms now, is they're under duress. They're with unwilling interlocutors. It's not like you and I make a deal and we're both acting in good faith.
Right.
I mean, these are not marriages of love,
Yes.
and so the possibility of resistance, of lack of execution, of lack of compliance is just going to be part. I mean, these are very kind of crude arrangements in a way.
It's so the point, Ari. Really, that is the point. It's sort of, we were joking before about, if you had a boyfriend who was mean to you several times, you get rid of the boyfriend. You don't try to change him eternally because some people just don't want to change. But I have two children who just got into college. They're going in the fall. We didn't even look at some of these traditional schools. The one that I went to, Columbia, they were just not even options for us because it was my sense that even if there were all these restrictions placed on them and my child was safe, whatever that meant, they'd be living in an environment, people who were begrudgingly, tolerating them and their point of view. And I would like them to be in a place where people welcome their point of view, even if they argue with it.
Right. And I'm really torn on this because I think on the one hand, it wouldn't take an enormous amount of schools enforcing their own rules to at least create an atmosphere that doesn't feel like a free for all, right? I mean, if you had basic, because protests have been going on forever. Nobody's, crying about a protest or whatever, but if there had been no, it's almost like a reverse, like the Dayenu at the Seder, like if there had been no encampments,
Yes.
like it would have been enough,
Yeah.
I mean, so I think restoring the campus as a place of basic civility seems to me doable. The danger, as you articulated, is that in the kind of cool quotient now, the energy is all going to be on the pro-Palestinian side.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like
Right.
in terms of the vibes, in
Right.
terms of like nobody is going to be defending this on campus. Nobody is going to want to be seen as taking Trump's side. Nobody's going to want to see us taking an Israel side. And so do you just shove those feelings underground? And you kind of like, even I think, and this is even people who are maybe neutral or kind of mildly pro-Israel do have qualms about the free speech issues at stake here.
Yeah.
And I think that the danger here is that, you sort of, do you win the battle but lose the war kind of thing?
Right. And then I guess that leads to that ultimate question of like, which is this a winnable war? I think Jewish students, not just Jewish students, but all students who believe that this is madness and gone too far and don't like living in this kind of environment, whether it's on this subject or it's an Occupy Wall Street topic, it's the same groups of people doing the same sorts of things. And it's disruptive at a level that, the average non-Jewish kid from Idaho would feel if he's walking across campus. They should be expected to want to fight for their right to stay at their school under the conditions that you're trying to get to, this civil sort of academic environment. But you wonder at what point one has to acknowledge that some of these places are unwilling and unable to change. And you can't achieve that goal at that school.
Yeah, and that the effort to change them, backfires, or that, if you're that kid from Idaho and your last year and a half at Columbia, let's just say, I don't know, has been kind of a nightmare. Who are you blaming? You're probably blaming everybody.
Right.
You're probably blaming the encampments, but you're also blaming the administration, and you're seeing your school on lockdown, and then you're seeing people maybe get arrested. I mean, you just don't want to have anything to do with it. I mean, the whole thing kind of drags everyone down.
Yes.
In a way.
Yeah. And not least of whom are Jewish students who don't want to spend their lives defending themselves and their Jewishness. It doesn't require defense all the time. They just want to live and study physics or art.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it's doing wonders for their Jewish identity or their sense of belonging either, obviously. And so I don't know who wins.
Yeah. And you can guarantee that, the faculty are going to be whispering in the faculty lounges and in hallways, that, and they're going to blame Trump, and they're going to blame the Jews.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they're going to see
maybe
that.
Not even whispering.
And this is always a danger for Jews, is that, they become sort of associated with, a power or whatever. And it becomes sort of.
It's not a reason not to fight. I think we should point that out.
No.
We like fighting for what's right.
We love fighting for what's right. But, I think there's a way to fight. There's a way to fight. And fight off in fighting, the famous phrase, you go to the war with the army you have, not the army you want. I mean, I do think some of these measures make sense as a way to sort of restore these campuses that have gone off the rails.
Right. Okay. Do you feel like you got your Columbia anger out?
I got it out.
Good. Every show we have to get it out. Let's move on to Tipping Point.
Great.
We're going to talk about a particular race for a Supreme Court seat in Wisconsin that's going on. The election is Monday, I think. And there's a Republican running, there's a Democrat running, and whoever wins will determine the makeup of the court. It's 3-3 now, Democrat and Republican, and obviously whoever wins will tilt the court in that party's favor. Huge money, you alluded to before, has come in. Elon Musk on one side.
Well, the Musk connection, it's kind of wild. So Wisconsin has this rule where you can't buy cars directly. You can't walk to a Tesla dealer and just buy a car. You have to buy it through these kind of family middlemen, which obviously is a pork barrel sop to, a constituency. But, this obviously Musk hates this because they take a cut, out of it. And so he kind of, it's just a funny kind of very local sort of
place for him to be. Right. Let's hope they don't key the cars there too.
Right.
But so this race is happening. Musk has poured a lot of money in. On the other side, George Soros and Reid Hoffman have poured a lot of money in. I think it's over $100 million
No
now.
relation, if only.
No relation to Reid. So the issue is that the liberal candidate, her name is Susan Crawford. If she were the deciding vote, she'd be deciding lots of things like voter ID, school choice, important issues that would affect people in Wisconsin. But maybe the bigger story is that she's openly said that she would gerrymander districts to sort of create 2 more Democratic seats in the state legislature. The Senate is Republican, but this would tilt the Congress towards Democrats. And it's a swing state, Wisconsin. It went to Trump in 24. So Democrats are really excited about the potential of showing that there's movement in their direction headed towards the midterms. They've won a few special elections in a row recently. And so they're calling this momentum, and they're talking about the midterms. And then they're also talking about 28. And this is like a bellwether for them. Republicans are downplaying that tremendously. And I think I didn't look this morning. I don't know if you did, but last I looked in the polls, Brad Schimmel, the Republican, was actually ahead, but that's constantly moving. Do you think this is a referendum on Trump? Do you think this is a referendum on the Republican Party? Do you think it's an indicator for the midterms?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. Wisconsin is always kind of, these local Wisconsin elections always seem to be big news.
Yeah.
Going back to when Scott Walker was governor,
Yes.
and Wisconsin is an interesting state. I mean, its roots are kind of as a Midwestern progressive state. This kind of Midwestern liberalism that's sort of extinct now, but sort of agrarian and
Cheese, I think. Cheese.
Yeah, cheese. But it's swung to the right, as many other swing states have swung, and Trump won all the swing states in this year, 2024. I would say it bears watching. Democrats just won a state Senate election in a very, very red section of Pennsylvania. Folks are already looking to next week, where there's a special election in a red district in Florida that the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, won by, I think, over 30 points and is now showing a dead heat. It's hard to know. I think one thing is these races are very local. I saw in my own home district in Nassau County, with the George Santos district, that in Nassau County is very red these days. Not very red, but moving red. But Democrats savvily picked in Tom Suozzi, a kind of moderate Democrat who's pro-Israel, and so I think it's about choosing candidates that make sense in these districts. But yeah, of course, Republicans should be worried if there starts to become a trend of a Democratic winning streak. I mean, the conventional wisdom always is that the party out of power wins the midterms.
Right.
So,
isn't there a Supreme Court case now about Louisiana?
There is.
I had read about
gerrymandering,
sort
of whether you can
based
use
on
race as
right.
As
Will that ruling impact? Well, it's too late, I guess, because this is going to happen on Monday.
Yeah,
but
we're not going to get it.
Hypothetically, I mean, this isn't really about race in Wisconsin, but what impact will a ruling one way or the other in that case have on?
Gerrymandering is a very complicated subject. It's roots of the Voting Rights Act are back in the Civil Rights era, and the question is, is the district being made on the basis of politics, which is non-reviewable by courts, or on the basis of race, which is reviewable? And the difficulty is those two things often go together, right? Not always, but often.
Especially in the age of identity politics.
Right.
I mean, how do you separate them?
Right. No, exactly. So yeah, we'll see. I mean, one of the scuttlebutt, some of the scuttlebutt we're hearing here at the Sun is that Elise Stefanik might be withdrawn as the UN nominee because the Republicans don't want to lose more seats and don't want to lose her seat. So I think the party is taking this seriously. Remember, especially as the big legislative fights are coming up, namely tax reform.
Right.
So far, Trump has mostly, governed by Sharpie, but we're moving, I think, to a phase where the Republicans are going to need every vote they can get.
Yes.
It is worrisome to be losing these seats. I think it's a little bit too early to try to extrapolate why. I think the economy is obviously worth keeping an eye on. How are people thinking about prices? How are they thinking about, kitchen table issues?
Yeah. I think it's just generally also really important to remind everyone that politics is local.
Hmm.
And these races, I have never voted in my life for a state Supreme Court seat.
Hmm.
I'm going to start,
Hmm.
I think. If you want they have national implications, these races. And if you want the results that you want, you have to pay attention to all of these races. And it's exhausting for the average person, but it's really important. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah. I mean, I think another thing to look at, there's been a lot of sort of noise rather than signal around this, is the news that there is some discontent among, let's say, town halls nationwide. I mean, that's another thing to think is to keep track of is some of the cutting, the concern over Social Security. Does that register, at the ballot box?
Right.
I think that's possible.
Yeah.
Um,
I think we have to get like Mark Halperin in here and
yeah.
get some serious poll results to
Yeah.
figure it all out.
You're always welcome, Mark.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to sunburn now.
Great. Go ahead.
You're in happy mode today,
Happy.
so you're going to
Yeah.
go last. Okay. My sunburn is President Christine Lagarde. She's president of the European Central Bank. I like to rag on Europe, I think, almost as much as Vice President Vance
Right.
does. The President Lagarde has
It's a high bar.
almost as much as you like to rag on Colombia. President Christine Lagarde at the European Central Bank has announced her intent to launch a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, this October. And there's been a lot of response to it. They say that it's necessary to sort of deal with, to sort of cost-saving effects against places like Apple and Apple Pay and Google Pay, and it's much more efficient to have their own digital currency. But we've seen what government control over fiat currency can do, let's say, to the truckers in Canada who resisted Justin Trudeau's policies and had their bank accounts switched off and had GoFundMe accounts unable to send them money. So the idea that government can control money and use it as leverage for their own political goals is of concern. If you turn that on to a digital platform and make everything digital, imagine the impact of that. And I think that Europeans have already demonstrated themselves to be willing to be controlled by a central administrative state in ways that Americans find shocking when it comes to speech. I think if they hand over the rights to their own money through a project like this, they're going to be stunned at the implications. And I think it's just a warning to the rest of us in the West if the Europeans and the Americans are still all part of the same thing that we call the West. We're not immune to this happening to us as well. And I think it's really important. We're going to have an interview next week with someone who's going to walk us through crypto and Bitcoin and explaining how that is one of the ways to kind of counter this idea of centralized government control over its citizenry. And so my sunburn is President Lagarde. And maybe, again, I think I've said this before, everyone in Europe who doesn't push back and say no to these creeping policies that seem small and not important today, but in very short order will be really upending for their way of life. And I hope that Americans at least pay attention and don't head down the same road.
Great. Well, I have a nice thing to say about a European, but he's been long dead, and that's Oscar Wilde. And wanting to encourage everyone to see.
I just saw Dorian Gray last night.
That's what I was just going to talk about.
Oh, okay,
my
go
review's coming out in the Sun, and feel
Great.
free to disagree, but I thought it was wonderful. I thought it was smart and spectacular. It stars Sarah Snook, an Australian actress from Succession. And what I liked so much about it was it didn't sort of talk down to its audience. I thought it struck a great balance between edification, entertainment. Wilde's prose is so fun, and it harnessed this use of the screens and digital camera work, which has become almost sort of par for the course on Broadway, but I thought in ways that were really inventive and really smart. I love that it was 2 hours, no intermission.
Yeah.
I thought its length was great, and it delighted me. I went to a matinee the other day, and I walked out, and I just felt a little brighter and smarter and sort of happier than I did going in.
Yeah.
I don't know how you felt.
I mean, I loved it. First of all, I've never seen Succession, so I was that girl in the audience thinking, who's that amazing actress? She's going to be somebody, right? And she was fantastic. Sorry, she was amazing, and just the ability to navigate. I mean, it's hard to understand unless you see it, but not just that she was basically speaking for 2 hours straight, but and remembering all her lines, but then navigating where she looked and which screen to look into, and it was brilliantly done from a staging point of view, and I thought that interplay with screens, given the subject matter, was very relevant and
Use of
interesting.
Filters and selfies, and
it was brilliant.
It
was loved it.
Anyway, go see it if you can. Thanks so much, Rebecca.
Good to see you, Ari.
Week.